the rituals that people go through when they have a change of life, like the rituals that mark the end of childhood and the beginning of adulthood, or weddings, or funerals, but rather more like when people are forcibly migrated, when people become refugees because they're displaced from their familiar environment. Because in a sense, what has happened to us is that without warning almost, and without our consent, our world was changed in a way that seems now to be kind of irrevocable. We know that the world is never going to be quite the same again as it was. And so what happens when you go through such a discontinuous, a sudden change, a crisis, is that all your taken for granted realities, everything that you were accustomed to in life, your normal, your everyday, your expectations of life, the roles that you played, your routine, your eating habits, everything was pretty consistent. And then one day we go into lockdown and most of that becomes redundant. And it's as if you've been forcibly migrated into a new world where so much is unfamiliar, even to the most intimate aspects of our lives, like how we interact with family and friends, how we greet, and not shaking hands, social distancing. Even the most intimate aspects of our lives have been disrupted. And so I think for everybody, this is a huge shock to the system. And unlike a sudden crisis like 9/11, where an event happens, and then as you move away from the event, people adjust and recover and process what's happened, the crisis that we're in is an unfolding crisis. It's going on all the time. It's not a singular event that occurred that we're now moving away from. We're living in it. And the point that we're at now almost feels, if you listen to the doctors, it feels like we've been in this protracted dress rehearsal that we thought was the main show. And all of a sudden we've discovered that actually what we thought was the show was just a dress rehearsal, and the show is only starting now. That is that the numbers are suddenly escalating and the crisis is about to get really big. And I think that for a lot of people, that's almost like another wave of shock, because people are tired and in many ways worn down by the lockdown up to now. Now it feels like we've got to kind of reclaim our strength and our resilience to prepare for the big challenge, which is about to happen. So what happens is that when all your roles and your lifestyle and all your taken for granted realities become redundant, you feel dislocated. You feel as if you've been forcibly pulled out of your familiar world into a kind of a no man's land. And with that is also a feeling of disenfranchisement, because your agency and your autonomy has been taken away from you. And all of a sudden, all of these things are being imposed on you, and your life has been changed in a way that you had no choice over. And so there's a sense of outrage and resentment over that. And then there's also a sense of disorientation, because all your taken for granted realities are no longer there. And it's kind of bewildering and confusing and hard to find your bearings. And so when this happened, we all have been thrust into a kind of betwixt and between stage where our existing reality is no longer viable. And the new reality, not only has the new reality not been born yet, but we can't even predict it. So for example, when someone has a bereavement, they go through the same process that we're busy going through, but they can start anticipating and imagining their life in the future without the person who was lost. but we can't really imagine our lives in the future because there's so much uncertainty. And this applies particularly to people who've lost businesses or lost jobs and really don't know what the next step is likely to be. And so we live in this kind of suspended state of not knowing, of confusion and doubt. And this is also something that's very draining. And so I want to just go through different models of the kind of emotions that we're going through. So the first one is a kind of crisis model where we saw at the beginning that when this first started, people were either euphoric, like this was kind of almost celebratory. You know, we're at home, we're in tracksuits, we're discovering all lovely things, and life is fun, and this is actually quite a welcome holiday. And then there were people who were fearful and despair, and obviously neither of those responses is necessarily the healthiest response, because the healthiest response is the response that is most aligned to reality, to the reality of the situation. But then after that kind of buoyancy and that sort of forced optimism, what we might call a kind of a manic defense, people have now gone into a state of despair and discouragement. And will this ever be over? And also, we've in a sense been taken back to early childhood. If you can remember being a child and you knew that something was going down, the adults were talking about something was going down, you could hear you knew meetings were going on, and maybe you heard voices behind closed doors, but no one was actually sharing with you the reality of what was happening. Or children who go through divorce and their parents are fighting and they don't know who to believe. And that is what's happening to us. No one's really telling us exactly what the story is. They're conflicting messages, authority figures, governments, doctors, all kinds of people are disagreeing with each other. And so that little child in us has been re-evoked, feeling kind of helpless and insecure and waiting to see what the grown-ups are going to do. And I think that it's important for us to attend to that younger part of ourselves that needs us to be present to him or her and to give ourselves that support. So we could also look at it on a more biological level, which is that when we get into a survivalist mode, when we're threatened, we go into a fight or flight state, which means that we either get ready to battle or we get ready to run away. And first of all, when we're in a fight or flight state, our blood supply goes to our limbs so that we can either fight or flight, and it goes away from our organs. And that's why stress can be very dangerous and very damaging, because it takes oxygen and blood supply and resources away from your vital organs. That's just a side point. When fight or flight don't work because there's nowhere to run to and there's nowhere to fight, we might go into a freeze response. And the freeze response is where we shut down, we become demoralized, tired, restless, sad, worried, overwhelmed, angry, exhausted, which I think is where a lot of people are, except for the people who not acknowledging that, and I think getting kind of rebellious and being bravado and not wearing masks and pretending like nothing's going on, or the doctors are just blowing this out of proportion, or this isn't so bad, which is also a childish kind of defensive state. Then I think for even people who never experienced anxiety before, I think for a lot of people, anxiety has become a new reality. And anxiety is ruminating thoughts, you know, when you go over the same thoughts in an unproductive way, difficulty sleeping, panic, on a physical level, heart racing, rapid breathing, tight chest. And all of those symptoms are signs that your fight or flight response has been triggered. And then the freeze state can also become apathy and numbness and dissociation, where you almost like go into a fantasy world where you just go into a kind of a daydreaming state. Then for many, there's also, and of course, these are not necessarily in order and they can all happen times, but there's also anger at the feeling of disenfranchisement, the sense of outrage of all these rules and restrictions being imposed on us and our lives as we knew it, having been kind of ripped away from us. And then the anger is also a cover for our sense of helplessness and vulnerability. It makes one feel sort of empowered and strong to be angry, which is a way of avoiding our sense of helplessness and vulnerability, because in many respects, we have all been rendered to a greater or less extent quite helpless and vulnerable in our lives. And so the freeze response to depression and to feeling overwhelmed. It's interesting that for people who are accustomed to being in crisis mode, people who had very tumultuous younger lives and who struggle with issues of anxiety and depression, they might actually be having an easier time now, because in a sense what's going on is actually what they've spent their lives preparing for in an ironic kind of way. And then there's also denial and what we'd call the optimism bias, where people only look at the bright side and don't consider the realities and the dangers and the vulnerability. And obviously, while it's good to be optimistic, when you have a bias towards optimism and you're not looking at the vulnerable side, you're not looking at it in a balanced way, you're also not paying attention to and taking care of vulnerability and your own inner feelings. And all of this emotional roller coaster, this constant shifting of reality and changes in routine and cabin fever that people are experiencing from being confined to their homes, and all of that can lead to an exhaustion, where a lot of people are. And then, of course, people can also experience a kind of shame and embarrassment about how you're dealing with this new reality. You might have discovered aspects of yourself that you didn't know or want to believe were there. And I think if people underplay how big this disruption is in our lives, then you also wouldn't give yourself credit for how much difficulty you have dealing with it, and for coping, because I think that coping is being happy-go-lucky, whereas coping is really just about adapting to the reality and getting through it and being able to survive. Of course, a lot of people have a very lonely time. A lot of people have had to go through on their own, which is extremely lonely. And for others, the people that they're with, even if it's their own family, might not be their primary sources of support and emotional nourishment. So even if you're with family, you can potentially feel lonely in your own home, especially if your fulfillment came from work or from interests outside of the home. And there could also be a sense of hopelessness and boredom. I think the longer this goes on for, the harder it is for people to keep and their children occupied. And so boredom becomes another challenge. So I'm going through this kind of checklist of emotions because I think that it's important to recognize and embrace all your emotions and to be present to yourself and to be aware of what's going on in you, so that you can attend to your needs and feelings. Because if you're not tracking your emotions, you can't really attend to them. So I've given you a kind of a broad sweep of what we're going through and our reactions to it. So what I'd like to do now is this is really the important part, is to talk about how we can deal with this, how we can find our resilience, how we can adapt to this change. So the first point that I'd like to make is that we could say that discomfort in life is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Suffering is something that we impose on ourselves. And the cause of suffering, as opposed to discomfort, is when we resist reality. In other words, reality can be uncomfortable. It can cause us pain. It can cause us distress. But we only suffer when we start to tell ourselves that life, our circumstances, our situation be something other than what it is. That resistance to the reality, the belief that things should be the way they once were and they shouldn't have changed, that is a cause of suffering. And so one has to try impulse to deny the current reality and resist the change. Of course, nobody likes change, especially when it's full. But you have to realize that until you embrace, as the saying goes, go with the flow of the shifting reality that you are going to suffer. And suffering in Judaism, the Hebrew word for it is tsar. And tsar means to be constricted, to be confined. Like we say, mina meitzar, from the straits are called to Hashem. It's the same as in Mitzrayim, the same word. It's like a slavery. It's like being confined in a tight space. Because when we are in a state of suffering, we contract, and our vision of the world becomes like tunnel vision and contracted, and our hearts contract, and we become disconnected from our own feelings and therefore we lose empathy with the people around us, and our behavior becomes rigid and restricted and mechanical. And so the challenge is to avoid becoming contracted and to try and stay in an open, expansive state. And you can only stay in an open, expansive state if you embrace reality, if you welcome reality as a friend, as a guest, rather than try and push reality away as if it's a threat to you. So it's a kind of discipline to not live in nostalgia, what was, what should have been, what could have been, what might have been, but what wasn't. And to not live in the past. So the current reality really provokes us to draw deeply on our inner resources and to develop new ways of coping and hopefully even thriving. This is like a boot camp that can help us to develop resources and capacities and skills that we would never have thought of trying to develop or needed to develop had we not had this crisis to give us the opportunity to find mastery. So the starting point of developing good coping skills is to use this pandemic as an invitation to live more fully, more thoughtfully, and more deeply, to become more deeply engaged with what it means to be alive and what it means to be human living in these times. And we see many role models and examples of this, people who started NGOs, who feeding the poor, people who become more alive to the world around them, to the needs of others, to the wealth inequalities in the world, to what privilege means. There's so many opportunities in this pandemic to wake up and to see the world in a more mature, more thoughtful, and I would venture to say more righteous way. And to see how you can use this as a time, as an opportunity to deepen your humanity, to deepen your sensitivity towards life, and to not be stuck in your own subjective framework and become self-absorbed and preoccupied with what's happening to you, but to find the energy and the motivation to become more deeply engaged with the world. Then becoming more deeply engaged and living more fully means deepening your appreciation of the gifts of life, because we're all confronted through this pandemic with mortality, and that sense of mortality is creeping up as the figures go up, and as we start to know people who've got COVID, and the fear that suddenly this illness is around us. And I'm not suggesting one becomes fearful, because the doctors seem to be saying that one shouldn't be fearful, that in all likelihood most people will get through this relatively unscathed. But we need to use very visceral sense we have of mortality being such a real thing, to wake us up, to enliven us to the gifts of life and the privilege of life, and so that we are grateful for every new day, for the help, for our health, and for the people around us. This is a time to really enjoy life, and a lot of people are not working as hard as they used to, and spending more time at home. And this is an opportunity to develop new appreciation for the people around you and for the life that you have. So this is an opportunity to up your game on a physical level, to become more physically healthy, more physically fit, on an emotional level, which is all the things that I'm talking about, and also on a spiritual level. And this could be a time to discover your strengths and your potential for greatness, because for many people, we're so caught up in life, we're so caught up in busyness, that we don't really have time to reflect and to think deeply about what we want and what we could be most usefully doing in the world. And now we've been given time and opportunity to do that, and it would be a pity to lose this opportunity. Then we have to work on feeling, on exercising our freedom to feel secure. And the key to feeling secure is to maintain a sense of mastery and control over your life, which is obviously difficult when, as I said at the beginning, a lot of our sense of mastery and control of life has been taken away from us. And so what's really important in terms of maintaining that sense of mastery and control is to keep up your normal patterns of behavior, and your rules, so that you have a sense of stability and something that makes you feel anchored in your familiar reality. Everyone I speak to tells me that their sleeping habits have gone out the window. They're watching Netflix until all hours of the night. Their eating habits have gone off the rails. People who locked up at home are not getting dressed, staying in bed the whole day or staying in pajamas the whole day. It's really important to maintain that sense of self, to maintain the feeling that you're living in your familiar world, to keep up your normal habits and routines. And the same applies to children, to try and keep them in normal habits and routines. It means putting efforts into interests and hobbies, and things that normally give you pleasure and that enrich your life. It's also important to use this time to work on giving up addictions. Some people seem to have used this time to get more involved in their addictions, which is very unfortunate, both from the point of view of the opportunity of this time to up your game, but also in the sense that it makes you more vulnerable to getting seriously ill, especially if you're a smoker. And then also by proactively looking after your health, your eating and sleeping habits, you'll also feel more in control, more protected. But also when you improve your diet and your eating and sleeping habits, you also feel more present to yourself and more supported by yourself, as I said. And so it's important to keep up routines and not drift into a kind of free fall, which a lot of people do. Now, in terms of building up resilience, one of the key techniques for building up resilience is to actually use the faculty that we have of mental rehearsal. And that means rehearsing in your mind possible challenges that you might face should you get sick or someone around you get sick. Because we like to avoid things that distress us and unpleasant possibilities in the future. But when you actually visualize and rehearse potential scenarios, you can, number one, be more conscious of the precautions that you could be taking to prevent them. And you can also, in advance, mentally rehearse strategies and picture strategies that will be available to you when you need to deal with those scenarios, should they ever arise. And you can inoculate yourself and your children by going through this rehearsal in your mind, also about how you would cope emotionally with a healthy attitude and approach. In other words, picture what would be a healthy attitude and approach should that scenario arise. And let's imagine ourselves adopting that healthy attitude and approach. You can also set goals in terms of how you want this time that we're going through to change you. You can think about how you'd like to emerge from this. How would you like to be remembered? Or how would you like to remember yourself as having gone through this? What skills or character traits could you use this time to develop or improve on? Think of this as a boot camp, as a chance to work your psychological muscles, and decide how you can use this to make yourself a better, stronger, deeper, wiser, broader, more sensitive person. And then what are the steps you need to take in order to exercise those qualities, to make yourself into that person? You can also make an inventory of your values and ideals and morals and decide what's really important to you and how you can honor that knowledge of what's really, really important to you. And when you know what's important to you, what your real values and ideals are, and you hold that close, then you can draw guidance and security and strength from keeping faithful to what truly counts in your life. You can also develop resilience by learning from your own past. Think about all the challenging times that you've been through in the past, all the difficulties that you've had, going right back to your childhood, all the adversities that you've overcome. And then take stock of what you discovered about yourself through all those challenging times, your strength, your courage, your resilience, your resourcefulness, your wisdom, your skills that came through in those times. And reacquaint yourself, get more explicitly in touch with how many coping skills you actually have and what a resourceful person you actually are. And then you can use that knowledge again to think about how you can apply your resources to master the current challenges. If you put all this together, you can see that this is also a good opportunity to rethink your life, to consider new opportunities to redefine your work or what you want to do or how you want to work. For example, a lot of people and even companies are discovering that working at home or remotely actually works better. And also, given this new lifestyle and given that we don't have traffic and other things that took up our time, are there other projects or interests that you could take up or that you could pursue that you didn't have time to do in the past? Especially, I think that it's very good to relieve stress and to nurture oneself, to take up more projects around the house, like gardening or cooking, things that put you in touch with the earth, that put you in touch with nourishment, and that are also creative. I've noticed that I have a grandchild, and I've noticed in the numerous videos that we're fortunate enough to be sent by our children, that he seems to be, he's 2 years old, and he's constantly saying, Mazot, Mazot, what's that, what's that? And I thought, well, that's actually what we need to do. We need to get back to that little child in us that is curious and to look at things that are changing around us and become interested and engaged rather than fearful. Curious, just like, what is it? What's actually happening? Instead of making judgments or being defensive. And this requires developing a kind of equanimity, what we'd call Yishuv Das or Menuchas HaNefesh, where you don't become reactive or dramatize the circumstances, but rather become curious and dispassionate and try and understand deeply what's happening instead of becoming reactive. And then you can learn a lot about yourself by observing and trying to understand your own reactions to the developments and changes. And once you understand your own reactions, you can then consider how you can react in a more positive or constructive way. So this time is also presenting us with a tremendous opportunity for self-discovery, for self-awareness. And through self-discovery and self-awareness, you can also develop mastery over your emotions. So to become more self-aware, you need to learn to identify and pay attention to your emotions and to be compassionate towards yourself, which means greeting your emotions as if you're greeting a friend, just holding a space within you for your feelings, opening your heart and just noticing what you feel without judgment, without trying to change it, without criticism. Just pay attention to your feelings the way you would to a friend or to a child, and make time to reflect on your experience, because when you reflect on your experience and you stay connected to your feelings, you won't become anxious. When you become anxious, it's because you're losing touch with your real feelings. And it's good to even keep a journal of your insights and impressions, because you might find that you have great insights and you actually find wisdom within yourself through this time. And it would be a good thing to record them in a book so that one day when you're looking back, you'll be able to look over everything you learned in this time. which is a very rich time for learning about life. And of course, it's very useful to get in touch, not only get in touch with your emotions, but also especially your sense of powerlessness at times, your fears, and your fear of loss, particularly because we have a fear of anticipated loss, but we've also experienced a lot of losses. I didn't mention that earlier, but I think a lot of people are experiencing grief over what was, grief over what they has been lost in life. And there are many things that might not even return to the way they were, for example, like travel. And so we have to pay attention to those and expressing feelings, especially, for example, through crying, helps us to release our feelings and to, in a sense, wash out our emotional system, and confiding in others and getting support from others is also a way of us to be resilient. And it's important to pay attention to your feelings and to stay connected to your feelings, so that when you do get support from others, you're not just venting or spilling out your feelings in an unconscious way, especially with children around, because that just winds everybody else up and upsets everybody else. But when you're talking in a conscious way, when you're being present to your feelings and sharing them, then you can get real support, but then you can also truly process your feelings. And it's important, I've been implying it, but I'll make it explicit, to accept your humanity, that we're all just doing the best we can with what we've got in a very uncertain situation. We're all just kind of learning as we go along, or making it up as we go along. And so we have to practice being more patient with ourselves, more forgiving of ourselves, and also more patient and forgiving of others, of humanity. Because we're seeing a lot of frailties in others and in ourselves. And this is a time to be more compassionate and more generous spirited and more giving to yourself and to the. This is also a good opportunity to practice leadership. And that means becoming the voice to yourself that you need, and becoming the voice to others that they need, to be a voice of encouragement and support to the people around you, and a voice of encouragement and support to yourself. And if you feel panicked or doubtful, to not spread it, because panic and doubt are more contagious than the virus. And panic and doubts to other people, and when you get involved in the news and all the hype that's going on, you cause people to lose heart, and you make life harder for yourself and the people around you. So it's important to keep abreast of facts and developments only from reliable sources, because it's only through that you'll maintain a sense of control. I think a lot of people, have already invented ways to stay connected. And I know that, many people are zoomed out and are finding Zoom and Skype and all of that alienating. But I think it's important to keep social and relationship bonds tight. It's easy for people to lose touch with each other, ironically, because they've got more time, but because people don't like Zoom and Skype. But I think that one can actually use Zoom and Skype to learn to communicate more effectively, to try and overcome the barrier created by the medium, and work on trying to create as much immediacy as possible through using these media. So I think that really, as I said, this is an opportunity for real personal growth on so many levels. It's an opportunity to reassess our lives, to realign ourselves with what we really want and what's really important to us. And I really that's my wish for everybody, that we use this time as a time for growth and a time for betterment, as opposed to see it as a time of affliction. So I'm going to end my comments there and open it up for questions and discussion.
Does anyone have any questions for Leonard? I have unmuted everybody.
Yes, I have a question for Leonard. What I'm finding ironically is that I'm becoming, I'm having a sense of agoraphobia now. I don't really want to be out there in the world anymore and go out there and, you know, do whatever needs to be done.
Right. So I think that deep inside every person is a quality that we call atzlus. And it comes from Adam having been formed out of earth, out of Adama. And atzlus means inertia. It can be translated as laziness, but it's more an inertia. And it's what I call the inner Winnie the Pooh, the part of us that just wants to live in comfort, that doesn't want our boat rocked, that wants to maximize pleasure and minimize pain.
I can't get you.
And what happens, it's like when you come back from holiday and you think that you should end a holiday and be only too exuberant and excited about getting back to work. But in the meantime, the longer your holiday was, the more reluctant you feel to go back to work. And so what's happened, especially for those of us who are closet recluses, this time of being freed from the world has played into that quality of atzlus, which we fight against to get motivated and to get out there. And it, you know, when we go into a state of rest, it kind of creeps back. And it's quite hard to find that opposite quality, which is called zrizus, which is alacrity and enthusiasm and motivation. It's hard to find that again, but that's going to be the challenge, is to reconnect with that zrizus. And the way to do that is to become clear about what's important to you and to become clear about your values and your ideals and use that clarity about what you really want and what you aspire to get you fired up again.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, seems like that's it. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Does anyone want to put anything in the chat box? Maybe people are shy.
Jenny says, yeah, it is more like protecting ourselves.
Right, it is. But sometimes if you protect yourself too much, then you can become a threat to yourself, because you can protect yourself so much that you don't go out and get the things that you really need for your well-being. I think in terms of physical protection, if staying home means physically protecting yourself, then I think that's highly recommended.
If we all get cabin fever and we don't go out.
Yeah, I'd rather have cabin fever than COVID fever.
Yeah, take your pick. Good one. Anything else? Anybody?
People who are over conservative and things. Everything's going to be fine. They're blowing out precautions, preventive child like that. And people who don't want to wear masks, and I'm not watching the child.
Sorry about that. Anything else you'd like to add? It seems like we don't have any more questions here.
I'd like to say that what I found interesting is that the good things that have come out of this whole crisis and changes that when we go out there again in the world that we would like to implement, and certain things that weren't that positive in our pre-COVID days and that we just want to edit out again. And I think that's what's been so interesting about this crisis. What would you like to comment on that, Leonard?
Well, I think that that's 100% true. I think that that it's really helped people to review their lives and to think about what's working for me, what's not working for me, to reassess values and priorities. You know, what I've seen and what I hope will continue is that people will come out of this a lot less materialistic, just realize, you know, how much nonsense people invest time, energy, and money into, and a lot of frivolous activities that people used to think were important for their sustenance, you know, and entertainments, that people have realized they're actually more important things in life. So, you know, my hope is that this is going to be a time of great positive transformation for individuals and therefore for the world.
Definitely. And Michelle Blumenau says, yeah, I have a lot of work to do based on Leonard's talk.
We all do.
Definitely.
It's a work in progress, little every day.
Agreed. Any other questions, comments?
Leonard?
Yes.
It's Michelle Blumenau again. You know, you say a little bit every day, but it almost feels like it needs some sort of structured approach. Or will life just throw stuff at you that you just got to do the work anyway?
So I think it's difficult to find a structure in times of uncertainty. So, you know, what I'm suggesting is that you keep your usual structures, the structures that are familiar to you, so that you don't let go of everything. But I think it's important to keep that curiosity and to, you know, if you have too much structure, you kind of miss. You go back to creating a certainty and you miss new potential, you miss serendipity, you miss messages and possibilities that may be presenting themselves. So one's got to try and find the balance between maintaining stability, but also being open to new growth and new insight from what's going on around you and what's going on inside you.
Thank you.
I feel so bad. I seem to be hogging the space, but
Okay.
I think what we haven't addressed is the financial repercussions of this whole crisis, and how important it is that when we come out of this, that we need to support each other much more, support domestic business, and you know, focus more on you know, manufacturing locally, and yeah, supporting local business, and less attention on you know, imports and things like that, so that we can get things going, and also out of a sense of Ubuntu.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely agree, and especially, you know, people like restaurants and caterers and people that we got so much benefit from before this. I think personally, I think people need to stretch themselves to make sure that those people are sustained. Even though, I mean, we're all, including myself, financially vulnerable and uncertain. But as you said, I think this is a great opportunity to learn that we're all connected to each other, that we're all interdependent, and that we have to support each other. And I hope that'll also continue. I think people need to learn the lesson that when you get goods and services from friends, it's in order to give them income, not to squeeze discounts out of them.
Leonard, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that coping with this is, well, I find it very different for us who are over 70 than those of my children who are in their 40s, who have a very different, a more devil-may-care approach than to us who are really quite fearful and quite, it's very different at this age, I think.
Yeah, well, I think it's, I think that actually people who've got a devil-may-care attitude are, you know, without sounding judgmental, but I think there's something quite self-centered and irresponsible about that. I mean, there's been a lot, you know, I've heard 2 doctors talking about how many people in, you know, especially in our community, are not wearing masks and just carrying on life as if nothing's wrong. And besides the fact that that shows, you know, not enough care for oneself, it shows a real disregard for the health and safety of others, you know, which I think is a big problem. That's the one side of it. The other side of it is that I think that that if you are older, there is a greater vulnerability. You know, I got a phone call from a lady at Discovery, and she said, "Oh, they're just phoning all their high-risk clients to see how we're doing. So, and how can we help you?" I said, "Well, one way you can help is by not phoning all the time and reminding people that they're high risk, because I don't think that's very helpful. You know, everyone who's high risk has heard it often enough." And I said, the other thing you could do is reduce your rates and increase how much you pay people to go for therapy. But because they do the opposite. They squeeze harder and then ask you, you know, how you're coping. But I think that there is that vulnerability, and one has to live with that. You can't. There's a reality, and I think that maturity is obviously maintaining optimism and hope, but also embracing the vulnerability at the same time. It's not living in denial and being happy-go-lucky, and it's also not being paralyzed by fear, but finding a balance between being realistic, using that realism to take the necessary precautions, and being hopeful and optimistic because of that, you know, knowing that you've done that.
Thank you.
So, Leonard, you really summed this up so wonderfully today. And it was such a powerful session, which was actually a time of reflection. So definitely it was. Thank you for mentioning the different layers in all of this and explaining the checklist of emotions that people are experiencing at the moment and the psychology behind all of this. You know, it's so important to identify where we are at and look inwards. And thank you for your optimism as well. It really was refreshing for all of us. This has been so beneficial, and on behalf of the ORCHET team, ORT South Africa, thank you for sharing your incredible knowledge with us today and for your time, your precious time.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to do that.
Pleasure. And thank you all for joining us and your questions and insights. I'm sure you all gained a lot from this today.
I can see all the messages. Thank you.
Yeah, Leonard, thank you very, very much. It was wonderful, really refreshing.
Thank you.
Was